Hello, you guys. I will not be showing myself today because I have had such a chilled and relaxed day that um, I'm only comfortable house ready. I'm not YouTube ready. But what I will do is I am going to go ahead and I'm going to jump into this because I don't want to make this too long. But kind of my motivation for doing this particular live is because a lot of times we have people that make arguments that seem to be very intelligent arguments about slavery and the Black American oppression and things like that, things that are meant to basically tell us to get over it and stop making a bigger deal over the situation because it wasn't that bad. And I want to go over some of these key arguments that people use, some of our own people even are using to essentially weaponize how we view slavery and its atrocities against us, and to essentially tell us that in some cases we were better off as slaves. And so the topics we're going to cover tonight are the general Arab slave trade, because I'm sure you guys have all heard, well, the Arabs had slaves too, and they were castrating blacks and da-da-da. Well, we're going to go into the real history, and I've provided a lot of links, sources, and reading materials so you guys can read up on these. I have some books that you can read online and some books that you can purchase as well in the description box so that you can arm yourself to be able to argue with these kind of straw man arguments that people like to throw out to shut up the Black community whenever they bring up slavery. So we're going to talk about the Arab slave trade and how that differed. Sir Black, we are still slaves, but we're talking about chattel slavery right now. So we're going to talk about the general Arab slave trade. We're going to talk about white enslavement in the Ottoman Empire. We're going to talk about Africans because they held slaves too. We're going to talk about the family structure of chattel slaves because we're always told the Black families were better off in slavery because at least we were together. At least now we didn't have, a 70% single mother-led home rate back then. We're going to talk about global slavery because, the other argument is, well, slavery is everywhere. Everybody's been a slave. Everybody's enslaved everybody. It wasn't just the Black people in the United States. We're just making a big deal out of it. There's still slaves today. So we're going to talk about that as well. And then we're going to talk about medical experimentation on chattel slaves. And we're also going to be looking at the concept of race, and how the concept of race was used to create the most egregious, disgusting, and violent sort of slavery that the world has ever known. And that is chattel slavery of the Black Americans. So let's go ahead and get into all of that. Have I watched the movie Belle? No, I don't think so. So let's go ahead. I'm going to just dig right into this. I'm going to go through, I didn't put all of the resources that I am using on in the description box, but I did put some ones I thought would be useful for you guys. So I'm going to go through everything that I have, and then we can talk a little bit. So I want to talk about a couple of people that are kind of dangerous to our community. Larry Elder, Thomas Sowell, of course, my favorite idiot, Jesse Lee Peterson, people like that who make comments regarding slavery that can be used by those people who are racist or against the Black community, against us. And I want to be careful here because you guys know that I'm a conservative, but I'm not that kind of conservative. I'm not willing to just co-sign everything. I know Thomas likes to say that we essentially just need to get over it. Other people were slaves. I know Larry likes to point out the Arabs. So let's just go ahead and get into Arab slavery. And I'm going to be going to two different places to discuss Arab slavery. First, the slaves they preferred, and then I want to go into exactly what the slavery of the Ottoman Empire looked like, because it looked nothing like chattel slavery. So let's go ahead. Arabs, first and foremost, they enslaved everybody, not just Africans. In fact, Africans were their least favorite slaves. They did not prefer African slaves. They preferred Oriental slaves, Turkish slaves. They were all over East Europe grabbing slaves. And Turkey is highly Islamic now, but at the time it wasn't. So basically, if you weren't Muslim, you could be a slave. And Africans were their least favorite slaves to have. They preferred other slaves over them. Also, when we look at the number, because the argument will also be, well, the Arabs took many more slaves, right? But the Europeans themselves admit that calculating the statistical dimensions of the slave trade, whether that be in terms of slave deaths or even the number of slaves that were taken from Africa, since the 15th century is not something that is as cut and dry as people like to make it seem when they start making these arguments. When we start getting into the Arab, the Spanish, the Portuguese slave colonies, our numbers become highly unreliable than the ones for North America. We have very reliable numbers for what went on in North America. When we consider slavery that continues into the 19th century, the stats are still very poorly documented. If we look specifically at the Arab slave trade, all of our historical documents, the things we really have, containing statistics are not really reliable because this is what the Europeans admit. When we look at Arab slavery produced, when we look at documents of Arab slavery produced, let's say by the British government, they admit that they inflated it because they were trying to start a propaganda war against the Arabs in East Africa. So a lot of these numbers, when people quote and try to make a big deal out of Arab slavery, one, it's not even relevant, right? Because we aren't the slaves of Arabs. We're the slaves of Europeans. We're the descendants of slaves of Europeans here in this country. But two, it is an admitted fact that those things were inflated because there was a propaganda war against the Arabs at the time. So those numbers are not reliable. Indeed, there is a great deal of dispute over the figures for the Arab slave trade. People argue a total of 17 million slaves over the entire course of the Arab slave trade. Now, mind you, the Arab slave trade went on much longer, not just for Africa. They were taking slaves from everywhere. It went on much longer than slavery here in the United States. So the numbers are going to be higher just because of more time. But also, if we look at periods where we do have reliable numbers, we can make a comparison looking at things such as, if we look at Arab slaves from Africa that were taken in the first half of the 19th century, we look at figures that exceed 3,000 in a year, right? We compare this to the estimate for slaves crossing the Atlantic, the most well-documented slaves, in the late 18th century. And our annual estimates are at 44,000 a year. Consider that. So whenever somebody brings up the Arab slave trade, we have to remember it went on longer. The Arabs didn't care about enslaving Blacks. They were their least favorite slaves. They preferred other types of slaves, and they indiscriminately enslaved everybody. Indiscriminately. If you were not Muslim, you could be a slave in their eyes. And the numbers were inflated for African slave trade because of a propaganda war. This is an admitted fact. And when we can compare numbers, the most reliable numbers we have, we see that the transatlantic slave trade was devastating. Many times over the solid numbers that we have per year for the Arab slave trade. So we really cannot compare apples to apples. But let's look at this in a little bit more depth, because I want to talk about what kind of slavery the Arabs engaged in, because we always hear, of the case of slavery in the Arab world where Black men were having their penises cut off. And so the idea is just that, that's what slavery to the Arabs was. It was so much worse because straight up you were going to get your penis cut off if you were a Black man and a slave in the Arab world. But actually, and if we specifically look at the Ottoman Empire slaves, slavery was pretty posh for them. They could even become royalty. People would sometimes want their children to become slaves because there was a lot of privilege there. We have to look at the fact that chattel slavery was nearly unknown in the Ottoman Empire. Even the label slave was a poor sort of label because many so-called slaves of the Ottoman Empire achieved high status. So we're not talking about the same kind of slavery when people are bringing up the Arabs. In fact, the Ottoman conception of slavery was tied to the overall Islamic view of human bondage, which is why, very pointedly, they were willing to enslave anybody. Furthermore, some slaves were able to marry nobility. As I mentioned before, people would hope that their grandchildren and children could be brought into an elite sort of so-called slavery because it was advantageous for them to do so. It was literally a stepping stone in society. None of this was going on in chattel slavery. So when people bring up Arab slavery, I would call on you guys to point out those facts. Do not be distracted by the Arab slavery card. It was nothing like chattel slavery. It was not exclusive to Black slaves. The numbers are only higher because overall, the Arabs just enslaved people for a much longer period of time from all over the world because they didn't even prefer Black slaves. They enslaved people indiscriminately. And the whole concept of slavery to them was a different concept. The one anecdotal idea of slaves that served harems being castrated, that would have happened whether they were African or not, but that wasn't the end-all be-all of Arab slavery. It extended past that to the point where they were becoming nobility, they were becoming royal, they could own things. The word slave we can almost not use it in the same way that we would use it when we're referring to chattel slavery. So the sleight of hand with the Arab slave trade is just that. It's a sleight of hand to tell you to shut up, to not bring it up because chattel slavery wasn't special. It wasn't different. It was just slavery like any other. And that's simply not the case. So with that said, let's go ahead and let's move on to, hold on one second. Let's move on to the next argument. The next argument is slavery in Africa, right? Because that will be the other thing that people bring up. Well, the Africans had slaves. There were slaves there. All these tactics to get you to shut up. Even some of our own people will use these tactics. First, it's the Arabs. Why aren't you mad at them? Then it's, well, Africans had slave. So let's talk about African slavery. Yes, slavery did exist in Africa. True story. But it was not the same type of slavery that the Europeans engaged in with the Blacks that they stole or bought from Africa. European slavery was chattel slavery, which is why we must make that distinction. Their slaves were property. They had no rights. That was not the case for slaves in Africa. You could become a slave in Africa, let's say, to pay off a debt or because you committed a crime. You definitely would lose the protection of your family and your place in society through that enslavement. But eventually, that slave or their children would be taken into the fold as part of the master's family, and they were freed. They were not perpetually slaves for generations. They were not bred to be slaves. That is completely different than chattel slavery, which is why I get very upset when people try to play the game between African slavery and what went on with the Europeans, because it is simply not the same. And the Europeans did not enslave their people the way that they enslaved us, because that's the other side of hand, right? Well, Africans had slaves. Well, Europeans enslaved other Europeans. It simply wasn't the same. And so we can't be moved by these arguments, and we can't let people play games with history. Enslaved Africans to the Europeans were slaves for life, as were their children, as were their grandchildren, as were they for generations. And those of us living today are just 3 or 4 generations from slavery. It was not that long ago. Our people have been free in this land far less time than they were slaves here. And I use free loosely for many reasons, but consider it was just recent history where we even attained any sort of real rights, if you can call it that, or the illusion thereof. So these games that we play, well, there was slavery in Africa. We can't allow that sleight of hand. It was not the same kind of slavery. Arab slavery wasn't the same. White on white slavery wasn't the same. Slavery around the world was not the same. These are not the same things. And so we need to combat these arguments, and quickly and firmly and with data, and understand the details of the thing, and not come from an emotional standpoint, but bring them the facts. Understand the slavery in Africa. So when somebody brings that up, you can clearly explain to them why African slaves have nothing to do with chattel slavery. Not even remotely the same thing. In African slavery, those slaves would eventually be free, either in their lifetime, and it would not pass on to their children, and they would become part of the family. You had European slave owners that were creating babies with slaves that they raped, and those children didn't even get to be part of the family by blood. So then how can we even begin to compare that? Perpetual slavery. Inability to even be a part of a family whose blood you carry, to slavery in Africa. But they do it, right? Because they want to make us feel as though we cannot speak on the issue of slavery. It's one of those things I plan to make a video, things people say to Blacks that they will never say to the Jews. Because a lot of these sleights of hands, they could pull with the Jews, but see, they'll never do that. But they'll pull them with us. Let's keep going. Thomas, my favorite intelligent Negro, he said, of all the tragic facts about the history of slavery, the most astonishing to an American today is that although slavery was a worldwide institution for thousands of years, nowhere in the world was slavery as controversial an issue prior to the 18th century. People of every race and color were enslaved and enslaved by others. White people were still being bought and sold as slaves in the Ottoman Empire, which we already discussed was not the same. Decades after American blacks were free. And he goes on and on and on and on. I mean, he is known for these ridiculous arguments that he makes regarding slavery. And essentially, the basis for his arguments are this: don't talk about it. Everybody suffered from it. And white people don't dare apologize for it because that's just absurd. That's his whole argument. But his argument is problematic. If we look at the math of things as we go into the next part of our topic, which is the family structure of chattel slaves, I really want to talk about this. We have been free for about 152 years. My great-grandfather, his father was a slave. My great-grandfather lived to be over 100. My Aunt Essie, her mother was a slave. When I was a child, she was 103. When she was born, she was a hair's breadth by a few years from being a slave. By a few years. If we want to put this in perspective, we have only been free for 152 years, and it sounds like a whole lot until you know that you have a grandparent who is 80 years old. Then it sounds a whole lot less. We're talking 2 or 3 generations. 2 or 3 generations. I have 2 generations of people that live in my home right now. Do you follow what I'm saying? When people try to make you feel bad as a Black person for bringing up slavery. Oh, that's old news. This has nothing to do with you. But it is literally possible that some of us, especially for those of us in our 50s, 60s, we knew slaves. We had people in our family that literally were free. They were slaves. If you have a family like mine where people live into their hundreds, you know some slaves. You've met some in your lifetime. You might have been a kid, but you met them. Oh, Thomas Sowell, water lily is who I'm talking about. So when we talk about the families of slaveholders having built legacies and wealth on the backs of slaves, we're not talking about wealth that's old wealth. This is wealth in the lifetime of people that a lot of us knew that were living when we were children. When we talk about wealth disparities, covert or downright in-your-face discrimination, these are realistic conversations. And when we talk about slavery, these are things that we can address from a real place. And we must address. Because it hasn't been long enough, because just like you know somebody who was a slave if you are old enough, and you have a family like mine where people live long enough, just like you know somebody, the people who owned us, they have the same legacy. They knew somebody who owned slaves. That was their great-grandfather, their great-grandpa, great-grandma. That is the reality of it. Yes, water lily. Well, Jesse Lee Peterson seems to think that sharecropping was a fun time and fair to the Blacks. But I suppose the fact that it was outlawed because it was keeping people in perpetual slavery just is completely lost on him. I mean, some people will say anything for a check, right? Some people will. Let's talk about the argument that, well, Black families got to stay together during slavery. We had intact families to the tune of, almost 80%. And now that we free, we can't keep a family together to save our life. Most of our community are in broken homes. There are no two parents. Slavery was better for Blacks because at least we had each other. That argument disgusts me to my very core, but let's talk about why it really didn't matter if you were on the same plantation with your mother and father. Because it's not like y'all were hanging out being a family all day. Right? This wasn't a party. It wasn't Club Med. It was slavery. During the day, your parents would be working in a field or in the house. And the children will be taking care of each other. Or old slaves would be taking care of them. And they'd be sticking their beautiful little brown faces into pig troughs. They'd be playing games where they beat each other because of the exposure that they had. They would be mated like animals from the time that they were 12, 13 years old. Oh, but that's okay because, well, we were all one big happy family. We had mothers and fathers all squeezed into the same filthy little hut. A person that makes that argument is a disgusting human being. The presence of two people that biologically created a child on the same plantation does not mean anything. It is crazy that this is such recent history and we know almost nothing. We know far less than we should know about childhood and slavery. We know almost nothing. When we talk about intact families during slavery, for people who make that argument to our community, we must remember that those children were property. Their parents were property. They were assets. They had monetary value. They were an investment. And the argument that they were just so valuable that they would be nurtured and cared for is BS. They're no more nurtured and cared for than a person whose corporation is running a factory without a union on their back and without a government to tell them that they need to behave. We know what people do when it is for profit in modern times. What do you think it was back then with no regulation and with human bodies at stake? The living standards were completely based on how nice the masters felt like being and how resourceful the slave parents were able to be, the best that they could make of the life that they were given. The best that they could make with the life that they were given. But that's okay because both parents were there. That's superior to now that we're just free willy-nilly and can't keep a family together. That is what some of our own people will have you thinking. And you never knew what you were going to draw as a slave. But let's keep talking about how these families were kept together. What was happening to the people in these families? They weren't provided with furniture per se. So if the slave father didn't have the time or the resources to make what they needed, be that a chair or whatever it was, a bed, they may not have it. The slave children worked as early as they possibly could. And they were also used for medical experimentation, right? Have you heard the stories that fueled modern medicine where they were drilling holes in little slave infant babies' heads? But their families were together, so that's what matters. That's what they'll say to you to shut you up. But Black people were better off during slavery. Families were intact. While the father of modern gynecology was shoving things in the vaginas of female slaves without anesthesia, but our families were together during slavery, so we were better off. Our children were forced to work in the fields, do clean kitchens, do housework. But our families were together because they were on the same plantation. So we were better off in slavery. And that's why when I hear fools like Jesse Lee Peterson and some of these idiots talk, I just get so irritated. Because how can you, with Black skin, sit there and open your mouth and say something ignorant? Something as ignorant as that. Let's look about the men. Let's look at what happened to them. Recognize that you could be paid as a slave owner for giving up your slaves for medical experimentation. This was big business. This was common. This is how all of this medical advancement we're experiencing now, it was on the backs of our slaves, of our ancestors, while they're talking about, let's not be bothered with slavery. And keep them in mind, a lot of these mindsets from just 2 or 3 generations ago. Let's say it for what it is, because 150 years are 2 or 3 generations ago. How many of you are parents? How many of you are parents? You and your child are 2 generations. Do you follow what I'm saying? Adults, that means you, your grandmother, your great-grandparents. Depending on your age, your great-great-grandparents. We are starting to put together literature. We are starting to put together literature that is actually looking into the history of human research in this country. The acquisition and exploitation of slave bodies for medical education was a huge industry. The medical schools in this country used slave bodies for research. Professional medicine used slave bodies for research, both in the classroom and for demonstration purposes. Both in the classroom and for general demonstration purposes. When they wanted to practice operating techniques, when they wanted, they had whole experimental facilities built just for this. It was huge business, but we're not talking about this. And this carried on past the freeing of the slaves, because we look at the Tuskegee experiments. We look at the removal of the wombs of Black women as part of the eugenics movement. We look at all of these things. We even look today where it is still believed that the biology of Black and whites are so different, that Blacks have thicker skin, that we feel less pain, so we're given pain medication less. Check out some of the resources I put. This extends to today. And this all stems from 2 or 3 generations ago. Our bodies and those bodies of our ancestors being used as tools for medical experimentation. Anesthesia free. Why was chattel slavery different? Why was it different? When we talk about global slavery, which is our last topic, why was chattel slavery different? Let's talk about why the slavery of the Black body was so different than all this other slavery people want to point to when they want to get you to shut up about slavery. Because that's all that they want. They just want you to shut up. Shut up about it. Shut up about the effects. You're not special. What the hell happened to you is not special. This happened to everybody, and you guys are just whining about it. But there's a reason why it was different, and let's get into that. I want to read you guys something. Okay? Given all the celebrations, conferences, special issues, and TV programs, everyone must know by now that it is 200 years since Charles Darwin was born and 150 years since the publication of The Origin of Species. That was in 1859. Now, mind you, his mindset extended before his time. That's why they thought we had tails. And we were a lesser evolved form of human beings. That's why chattel slavery was unique. Because we were actually literally animals. That's how they made it okay in their minds. Yeah, we had arms and legs and eyes and a nose, but actually we were beasts that looked a lot like humans because we had a little bit of human in us, but we were not fully human. Among the spate of books published for this occasion, one actually stands out in its novelty. The claim that Darwin's evolutionary theory was inspired by his hatred of slavery, as especially experienced during his epic Beagle Voyage. That's a nice try, but it doesn't convince anybody with sense. Thomas Malthus and the Galapagos finches provided a much more plausible origin for the theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin was, after all, a man of his time, class, and society. True, he was committed to a monogenic rather than the prevailing polygenic view of human origins. But he still divided humanity into distinct races according to differences in skin, eye, or hair color. He was also convinced that evolution was progressive and that the white races, especially the Europeans, were evolutionarily more advanced than the Black races, thus establishing race differences and racial hierarchy. His views on gender, too, were utterly conventional. This was the belief of the time that fueled chattel slavery. See, we are the only ones that look like us. Y'all, we're the only ones. Think about it. I was looking at the Miss World pageant for 2018. Don't ask me how. YouTube suggested a 10-minute clip of it. And as I watched all the contestants, there were maybe 3 or 4 Black women. I thought to myself, man, they look totally different than everybody else. It wasn't that everybody else was white. It's just that they all looked the same. Same kind of hair, same skin. Our women really stuck out in that group. This is what was the basis for making chattel slavery so different, because we were different. That's why I say when we point to white slavery in the Ottoman Empire going on after chattel slavery, when one of our own points that out, it is stupid because those white people were marrying royalty in the Ottoman Empire. They were trying to get their kids bought by rich families in the Ottoman Empire. They were coming up. Why were they coming up? Because of racial hierarchy. This was the thought of the time. Darwin went with the thought, the prevailing belief at the time, which is that everybody was human but us. We were the least evolved. In fact, it was believed we had evolved to a point where we couldn't evolve any further. Not only were we the least evolved, we weren't going to get any more evolved. Any attempt to separate a good Darwin from a bad social Darwinist cannot be sustained against careful reading of Darwin's own writings. This is why Black people who are pro-evolutionary theory, I don't even understand. How? This whole theory is built on you being an animal. The favored races. Darwin's words. He enthusiastically endorsed his cousin Francis Galton's view of hereditary genius transmitted down the male line and nodded cautiously toward eugenics. During the first 150 years since Darwin wrote such views on race, gender, and eugenics, while sometimes subterranean, they have never entirely vanished. We just ignore them. We teach racism in schools. We send our little Black kids to schools where they teach Darwinic theory, which is a racist ideology. It's racist at its core. That's what it is. This is how brainwashed we have all become. And dare you argue with a Black person about Darwin's theory of evolution? They will tear you down over his racist theory, grounded and founded in racism. We're just all going to ignore that, though. Using microevolution in the Galapagos Islands to prove macroevolution and that Black people are subhuman. Current developments in both genetics and neuroscience are raising them again. However, clothed in modern language. They are raising these racist ideologies again, but they are using modern language to stick them under the radar. And we are committed to these. The biological sciences are becoming re-racialized and resexed. Distinct population groups, not races in the biological sense, do, after all, show reliable variations in gene frequencies, some of which are associated with known disorders such as Tay-Sachs disease, cystic fibrosis. And there are small but robust differences chemically and anatomically between the brains of men and women, although nobody has any real idea what the implications might be. A recent essay in Nature even argues that it is time to reopen the untouchable question of racial and gender differences in intelligence. Remember that? Black people are stupid. You have low IQs, Black people. It's time to reopen that conversation while y'all are playing with the theory of evolution and holding on to this. They're sneaking these old theories meant to dehumanize us into the back door in modern time. The things that fueled chattel slavery into the back door in modern time. Biologists' problems with race are magnified out of all proportion by the well-meaning public policy attempts to categorize people by ethnicity, understood to be a polite term for the otherwise taboo word, race. In the UK, one is routinely asked to classify oneself by a bizarre mixture of skin color, geographical ancestry, and nationality. What possible purposes could such classifications serve? Questions about a person's race are only meaningful in a racist society. Questions of biographical ancestry? That's interesting. But see, race doesn't exist without racism, right? And race was created from a school of thought that was used to bring on chattel slavery, which is why that slavery was more egregious, which is why it was generational, which is why it was perpetual. Because, see, you were not a human. That's why we have the one drop rule. Because if you are an animal and you breed with a human, that animal blood creates a beast. And chattel slavery was the slavery of animals with human bodies. So the next time someone tells you, what about the Arabs? What about the other slaves around the world? What about white on white slavery? What about the fact that families were kept together in slavery and, oh, they weren't mean to the slaves because slaves were so important. They were valuable assets. They were nice to them. Let us not forget the origin of thought. The origin of thought surrounding slavery. When we talk about marriage, you ever heard that argument? Oh, but slaves were married. They were married. That's cute. The slaves were married, so it's all good. But make no mistake that marriage was not recognized. A slave could be, quote unquote, married to multiple other slaves. A so-called slave marriage didn't mean crap. It could be broken because somebody was sold, and some of these marriages were cross-plantation. You couldn't even go anywhere without permission. Your wife or husband could be rented out. They could be a prize. You know how we win money in the lottery? You could win a slave. Run out of money at a card game? You could use your slave. Keep playing cards. Want to bet at a horse race? I bet 2 slaves that Seabiscuit's going to win the race. This is the reality. That is the reality. When somebody says, oh, but the Africans had slaves. But African slaves were not in a perpetual generational slavery. They were not animals. They would personally become, or their children would become, part of the family of the household. So we cannot let people play games with this. And I just wanted to touch on this because I hear people, even our own people, because you hear somebody with a black face speak intelligently, and they are intelligent on these issues. But we have to go and to look into this. When somebody with a black face says, well, the Arabs enslaved more blacks than anybody, then we have to go look at the fact that we can't verify the Arab numbers. The Arabs enslaved everybody who was not Muslim, and that the whites admit they conflated and inflated those numbers because of a propaganda war they had against the Arabs. But what we do know is that the numbers that we can count show 3,000 Black slaves a year going in the latter part of the 18th century, was it? Or the latter part of the 17th century, and then in the early part of the 18th century, 44,000 Black slaves came into the States. That's what we do know for a fact. What we do know for a fact is that white slavery that our brother likes to wave around was going on after Black chattel slavery was abolished wasn't so bad for them because they could marry royalty. They could get rich. They could become part of the families that enslaved them on the regular. But that's not what was going on in the United States. We cannot allow people to use these sleight of hands. Because until we can have an honest conversation about slavery, the ramifications of that, and the mindset behind it, until people are willing not to shame the descendants of slaves in this country and other slaves from the transatlantic slave trade in bodies, until they are willing to stop shaming us for wanting to have these discussions and admit what chattel slavery was, that it was unique, that it was unlike other slavery, and stop trying to use card tricks to shut us up, then we cannot honestly believe that there is any sort of genuine dialogue that is going on. See, these are games that are being played. How are we having an honest conversation when we're teaching racism in schools as the norm via evolutionary theory? How can we? We can't. They are letting us know what they think. They are pushing the same agendas today: eugenics, murder in the Black community, racist theory, and that Blacks are animals via evolutionary theory. They're still pushing the agendas. They just have thrown some modern verbiage on there, and they've stuck you in their schools, and they've stuck your children in their schools to brainwash you into agreement with it. But we have to start pushing back and having honest conversations and not allowing people with our skin color and eloquency in their speech to be used against us, to push an agenda to shut us up and to stop an honest dialogue in these discussions. So I really do hope that the resources I provided give you a starting point to look into these things more, that you have, if you didn't already, a grasp on the arguments that you can make when some of these talking points are brought up regarding the effects of slavery, why it wasn't so bad, why we should all just shut up and stop talking about it. I hope that you guys found this helpful. With that said, y'all, I'm not going to stay on here forever. That's not my intention tonight. For those of you that came earlier for my conversation with Nyla on Black versus white femininity, she was very sick. She wasn't well yesterday, and she wasn't well today. And so that is why we didn't do that. So she was willing to do it. Okay. She was willing. I think she was fresh from the doctor, hospital, or something. And she's like, I'm just going to go home. And I was just like, no, please. That's very sweet of her. But we will have that conversation, God willing. So I'm sorry for those of you that were looking forward to that, but I'm happy that I was able to put this out. And yeah, you guys have a nice Friday evening. I know that it's late. And please check out the reading resources and the scientific papers and the books in the description box. Know that is not all of the information. It's just a starting point for you. You can take what you read or find there and you can expand on that research. And I hope that you do that. All right. I'll talk to you guys a little later. You guys have a nice evening.